In this lecture, you are going to learn about the Mexican route to independence, the South American route to independence, and Simón Bolívar and Gran Colombia. If you recall, during the 18th century, Spain had significant control over the Americas. The Spanish colonies in the Americas consisted of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, the Viceroyalty of New Granada, the Viceroyalty of Peru, and the Viceroyalty of Rio de Plata. But by the early 19th century, the map of the Americas will be redrawn as we enter a new era of independence. In Mexico and the other Spanish colonies, the Napoleonic Wars also sparked independence movements. For 15 years, the wars of independence raged across Latin America, from the northern deserts of Mexico to the cold, snowy passes of the Andes Mountains, which divide Chile from Argentina and South America. Spain's efforts to maintain its rich American empire was overwhelmed by its colonies' fight for autonomy and freedom from colonialism. Spain was pushed violently out of mainland America, and more than a dozen new nations emerged, committed to independence. In 1808, Napoleon forces Spain's king, Ferdinand VII, to abdicate and imposes his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as a new king of Spain. Then the French army occupies Spain and imposes control over the colonies. The imprisonment of the king creates a legitimacy crisis and resistance among those who saw Joseph Bonaparte as an impostor. On May 2, 1808, the Spanish people in Madrid rose up spontaneously against the French army of occupation and the French Bonaparte king. This was the opening for a civil war that lasted almost 6 years. Other Spaniards formed juntas or committees to work for the expulsion of the French and to carry affairs of the state in Ferdinand's name. By 1810, the Spanish resistance to the French occupation had been pushed to the southern port city of Cadiz. The Spanish liberals who led the resistance now called for a constitution. The Constitution of Cadiz was a truly liberal document and, if implemented, would have profoundly altered the Spanish Empire, but it was never fully implemented. The Spanish resistance to French rule also spreads to the colonies. Moreover, the people in the Spanish colonies also reject the Spanish juntas. The Spanish juntas did not give any representation to Spanish Americans.
Instead, they created their own regional juntas during 1808 to 1810. Juntas emerged to rule in the name of Ferdinand VII in Mexico City and Montevideo. Caretaker governments were the work of loyal peninsular Spaniards, eager to head off Creole threats. In Santiago, Caracas, Bogota, and other cities, by contrast, it was Creoles who controlled the provisional juntas. As the chaos continued across Latin America, people broke with formal authority.
Moreover, as Napoleon's conquest of Spain intensified, the social tensions that were simmering long before also continued to rise in the Americas. The Spanish had instituted a social and racial hierarchy with the Peninsulares, colonial officials born in Spain, at the top of the social and political hierarchy. Peninsulares were only 1% of the population. Locally born Creoles, people of European descent born in the Caribbean or Spanish America, were viewed as underneath the Peninsulares. Despite their social status, many Creoles were in fact wealthy landlords. But nevertheless, locally born Creoles had long resented the privileges granted to Peninsulares. Creoles felt abused and offended by Peninsulares, whom they increasingly viewed as foreigners in the Americas. Creoles claimed that their legitimate aspirations to hold office, to trade freely, and to be full citizens within the Spanish Empire were hindered by the imperial bureaucracy that favored Spanish Peninsulares over Creoles. As tension rose, Creoles identified more as being Americans than Spanish, and the chaos imposed by the French occupation of Spain will create a power vacuum, and Creoles will seize the opportunity to advance their control over the Americas. Interestingly enough, the first cries of the early independent movement in Mexico were not from the Creoles, but began first from subordinated people of color, which mobilized European ideas against European colonizers. The early leaders of this movement would be Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla and José María Morelos. In 1810, Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, a parish priest of Dolores, a small town northwest of Mexico City, summoned his mostly indigenous and mestizo parishioners to the church in the town square and read a call grito to revolt. The Grito de Dolores, or Cry of Dolores, has been proclaimed. Mexico was on the road to revolution. His call demanded the downfall of the bad government, but did not proclaim independence. He tempted the challenge with the slogan "Long live Ferdinand VII," professional loyalty to the captured monarch, while advocating the overthrow of the Peninsulars in the Americas, whom many saw as puppets of the French king. In this, he represented a sentiment that was widespread among Mexican Creoles. What Hidalgo did not foresee was the smoldering anger of the indigenous people in Mexico, which transformed the initial phase of the Mexican independence movement into a violent bloodbath. Within days, the 100 or so rebels from Dolores had become an army of thousands. Poor, rural people joined the rebellion. For many, their weapons were farming tools. The beloved dark-skinned Mexican saint, the Virgen de Guadalupe, was adopted as the patroness of the movement. The Creole elite of Mexico City, who initially supported Hidalgo, recoiled in horror at the popular following of Hidalgo's call, and soon the war for independence turned into a civil war between Hidalgo and the Creole. The Creole leaders of the insurrection witnessed the indigenous people rise against all white oppressors. Creole as well as Spaniards, Peninsulares, and Creoles were killed in large numbers. But the Creoles retaliated, seized the government, summoned the colonial militia, and raised new troops. In 1811, Hidalgos and his principal lieutenants were tortured and executed. This first bloody phase of Mexican wars for independence came to an end with Hidalgo's execution, but the movement that he sparked was by no means dead. Shortly after, another priest and a far better general, Jose Maria Morelos, assumed the leadership of the independence movement and continued pushing for Mexicans' freedom. Father Jose Maria Morelos was an officer in Hidalgo's rebellion. He was a mestizo, and his army was more organized and had clearer goals than Hidalgo's. Morelos' main goals were clear: an end to slavery, to the caste system, and to the tribute paid by indigenous people. Morelos prohibited the use of the caste classification. All born in Mexico were simply Americanos. In 1813, he declared outright independence. Nevertheless, Morelos was eventually captured and shot as a traitor on December 22, 1815. By then, small bands of patriot guerrillas had been fighting for years in several regions of Mexico, and with Morelos gone, they continued to defy the government, causing heavy military expenses, living off the land like bandits, and gradually gaining away at the fabric of colonial rule. After the defeat of Napoleon in 1814, King Ferdinand VII returned to Madrid, abrogated the Constitution of Cadiz, and restores the absolute monarchy and ordered the colonies to submit. Then Spain has its own liberal revolution in 1820. Spanish liberals forced Fernando VII to restore the Constitution of 1812 and to call the Cortes Parliament into session. The Cortes attacked religious institutions, striking directly at the vested interests of the conservative Creole elite in Mexico. The mystique of the monarchy suffered, and many formerly royalist Mexican Creoles felt betrayed. Moreover, the Creoles resented the reappointment of power of Peninsulares. By then, Creoles identified more as Mexicans than as Spaniards, meaning they were less likely to feel a sense of loyalty to the crown. This sentiment was spurred on by the Enlightenment ideology, which championed the ideals of freedom and independence. Creoles, however, needed the support from below to win independence. They needed to mobilize the support of the mestizo and the indigenous population. But Creoles had little interest in changing the social hierarchy that dominated. Few Creole patriot leaders wanted actual equality. Into the act stepped well-born Creole Agustin de Iturbide, an ardent Catholic and conservative who had fought against independence for years. Suddenly, he intended to lead the revolution against the liberals in control of Spain. The Creoles also formed an alliance with the larger indigenous population. By this time, Vicente Guerrero was the leader of the guerrilla movements, and Mestizo Guerrero had kept faith in Hidalgo's and Morelos' revolution. Iturbide and Guerrero rallied a winning coalition with guarantees of an independent constitutional Mexican monarchy that preserved traditional religious and military privileges and offered social union, vaguely implying the equality of all Americanos with peninsular Spaniards. In 1821, Iturbide and Guerrero declared Mexico independent. But Iturbide wanted a monarchy and wanted himself as emperor. So he will become Emperor of Mexico in September 28, 1821. His reign as emperor will not last long. Iturbide was unable to cope with the problems of the new nation. Furthermore, Iturbide expanding as he acquired the monarchy was repugnant to many. Then, with Iturbide suspending Congress, his opponents rose to a revolt. Led by Lopez de Santa Anna, Iturbide fell from power in 1823, and a republican constitution was enacted in 1824. Guadalupe Victoria was elected the first president of Mexico. Mexico was finally an independent constitutional republic. Political upheaval in the Andes started even before the French Revolution. In the 1780s, Andean indigenous peoples rebelled against Spanish colonial authority, demanding freedom from forced labor and compulsory purchase of Spanish products. An army of 40,000 to 60,000 Amerindians marched on to the capital of Cusco. This rebellion nearly vanquished the Spanish army, but in the end, the Spanish would defeat the rebellion. However, as we saw in Mexico, the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars soon brought new instability that resulted in the separation of the American colonies from European rule. On July 5, 1811, the Criollos in Caracas declared independence from Spain on 7 of the 10 provinces of the Captaincy General of Venezuela, declared their independence in Venezuelan Declaration of Independence. This movement towards independence will lead to the creation of the First Republic of Venezuela. Among the early leaders of the First Republic was Simón Bolívar. Bolívar was from Caracas, the son of a plantation-owning family who gave him a privileged education, including a European walking tour with his brilliant tutor. Simón Rodríguez, a man of fire with new enlightened ideas that will leave a mark on a young Bolívar. Another important figure among the First Republic was Francisco de Miranda. In 1812, Miranda is named commander of the rebel army. Miranda was a military leader with an extensive military career. Earlier, Miranda had fought under George Washington against the British, served as a general in the French Revolution, and fought with the French against Prussia and Russia. He also was a revolutionary who in 1806 had organized a rebellion but failed to gain independence from Spain. Years later, Bolívar persuaded Miranda to return to Venezuela, where he was made a general in the Revolutionary Army. When the country formally declared independence on July 5, 1811, he assumed dictatorial powers. Despite his experience, Miranda will not be able to keep the new republic intact. The First Republic of Venezuela was lost in 1812, following the 1812 Caracas earthquake and the Battle of La Victoria. Miranda, fearing a brutal and hopeless defeat, signed an armistice in July 1812 at San Mateo. The other revolutionary leaders, including Bolívar, believed his surrender was treasonable and stopped Miranda's attempt to escape. They allowed him to be handed over to the Spanish as a prisoner of war. He was then transported in chains to Cadiz. He eventually died in his prison cell. After the fall of the First Republic, Bolívar continued defiant against all odds. He escaped capture by the enemy and obtained a passport to leave the country and went to Cartagena in New Granada. There, he published his first of his great political statements, El Manifesto de Cartagena, the Cartagena Manifesto, in which he attributed the fall of Venezuela's First Republic to the lack of strong government and called for a united revolutionary effort to destroy the power of Spain in the Americas. In 1813, Bolívar was named commander of an army in Granada, and then he invades Venezuela on what came to be known as the Admirable Campaign. As a result of the victories in Venezuela, he was proclaimed El Liberador, the Liberator. He then proclaimed the Second Venezuelan Republic, but this free republic fell apart within a year. Bolívar had outsmarted the Spanish during the Admirable Campaign, but he had not defeated them, and there were still large Spanish and Royalist armies in Venezuela. Bolívar and other generals such as Santiago Mariño and Manuel Piar fought them bravely, but in the end, the Royalists were too much for them. Moreover, Bolívar could not win independence without the support of Latin America's non-white majority. The result was a cruel civil war. Bolivar forces were opposed by large royalist armies, including a cavalry unit of llaneros, cowboys of the Llano frontier, who were under the command of José Tomás Borés, and who cruelly executed prisoners and pillaged towns that had formerly been held by the patriots. Bolivar himself resorted to extreme measures, such as the shooting of prisoners. The Second Venezuelan Republic fell in mid-1814, and Bolivar once again went into exile as he saw his republic collapse. Most men would have given up at this point, but most men are not Simón Bolívar. Bolivar then fled first to Curacao, then to Colombia, then to Jamaica. While in Jamaica, Simón Bolívar wrote the Jamaica Letter in 1815. The letter read in part, "The hatred we feel for the peninsula is greater than the sea separating us from it. That wicked stepmother is the source of all our suffering. The chains have been broken, we've been liberated, and now our enemies want to make us slaves. We are, moreover, neither Indians nor Europeans, but a race halfway in between, the legitimate owners of the land and the Spanish usurpers, in the short, being Americans by birth and endowed with the rights from Europe." Moreover, the letter showcases that by now, Simón Bolívar began to steer away from his initial views of independence. The letter also states that Latin America does not need a monarchy, but it does need paternalistic governments, making the first hints that Latin America needed a strong hand and a dictator. In late 1815, Bolívar and his ragtag of surviving revolutionaries sailed to Haiti, where they were hosted by Haitian President Alexandre Pétion. Concerned that the fall of Napoleon might lead to European reconquest of the Americas, Pétion supported the cause of hemispheric independence. So after Bolívar asked for his help, Pétion will help Bolívar in exchange for the promise that Bolívar will free black slaves in Venezuela, starting with his own. In 1816, Bolívar began a 5-year campaign to liberate Venezuela and Colombia. With help of Haitian soldiers and money, Bolívar successfully landed in Ciudad Bolívar, Venezuela. This time, however, discontent against the crown and Spanish General Pablo Morillo would lead to a coalition of supporters for Bolívar. In 1817, the Llaneros, men from the plains of central and south Venezuela, joined the rebellion and became the first major fighters to join Bolívar against the Spanish armies. Then Bolívar will also have the support of blacks and even of Creole elites. Bolívar even had some interesting British and Irish mercenaries fighting for him. Then Simón Bolívar conceived a brilliant yet seemingly suicidal plan. He would take his 2,000-man army across across the mighty Andes and hit the Spanish where they least expected it, in neighboring New Granada, where a small Spanish army held the region unopposed. His epic crossing of the frozen Andes will prove to be the most genius of his many daring actions during the war. In 1819, Bolivar adds New Granada to territories free from Spanish control, and then goes to Venezuela. With this, Bolivar will finally win independence for Venezuela from the Spanish, but Bolivar wanted a broad confederation of Latin American nations, hoping that what is now Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia will band together to form Gran Colombia. As Bolivar had been fighting the royalists in North and South America, José de San Martín had been busy building patriot support and strategy in the South. His strategy was simple. From the province of Mendoza in western Argentina, Martín will build his forces and prepare for a secret crossing of the high Andes into Chile to take his royalists by surprise, and then send an amphibious expedition to blockade Lima. While building his army in the Andes, San Martín was joined by the Chilean independence fighter Bernardo O'Higgins. With Chileans fighting alongside him, San Martín defeated the royalists and rode triumphantly into the capital city of Santiago in February 1817. San Martín met a hero's welcome in the Chilean capital, where his movement gathered strength for 3 years before launching an expedition northward against Lima. The Viceroy of Peru withdrew from Lima into the Peruvian highlands, but he was unable to fully defeat the royalists. Moreover, Simón Bolívar, who had liberated the northern provinces of South America, had annexed Guayaquil, a port and province that San Martín had hoped would opt for incorporation in Peru. He therefore decided to confront Bolívar. The two victorious generals met on July 26, 1822, in Guayaquil, where Bolívar had already taken control. What passed between them in their secret discussions is unknown, but what is clear is that San Martín hurried back to Lima, a disappointed man. There, seriously ill, faced by recriminations and overt disaffection, he resigned on September 20th. Bolívar will then take Peru, Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia, and will band them together to form his dream Gran Colombia. But Bolívar will be immensely disappointed in the outcomes of independence, as his dream of a unified South America perished amid the rivalries of separate countries. Local identities prevailed and unstable national republics emerged. In the end, Bolívar will be exiled as the new republic sank into chaos, and he will die penniless as his dream of a Gran Colombia went into flames. Although independence was the final result throughout the former colonies, each region followed a distinctive path. but creating strong, unified nation states proved difficult in Latin America. The map shows where boundaries were drawn in Mexico, the United Provinces of Central America, and the Republic of Colombia. In each case, the government's territorial and national building ambitions failed to some degree. Ideas that spawned the American and French revolutions encouraged similar developments in the Caribbean and Central and South America. A new era based on radically new ideas of freedom and the nation-state emerged in the Atlantic world. The Latin American revolutions were fought in the name of liberty, but ended up consolidating the privilege of a few at the expense of poor, non-white, and mixed populations. Most of the new nations denied citizenship to slaves, excluded Native American majorities, and discriminated against the poor, the illiterate, and women of all ranks and races. For the most part, the new nation-states were controlled by military chieftains who were often allied with wealthy colonial elites.